And I've been asked to speak, well, I will speak for about 20 minutes and then hopefully show some pictures of various package holidays which I've been involved in for 38 years as a profession. And when I talk about we, I'm talking about our group, who mostly have been with me for 35 years. They come from 9 different countries, and pretty much the only thing which all of them have got in common is that I never pay anybody anything at any time. So there's no sort of financial motivation behind it. The sort of thing we've been doing since 1968 has been trying to beat our known rivals at the remaining physical challenges in the world, not just polar, it could be deserts and so on and so forth. And the key thing is if and when you reach your goal, you've got to make a big song and dance about it, which is what our sponsors like, and we rely totally on sponsors. And secondly, to stick your flag there before anybody else sticks their flag in the same place, especially the French. And I would say, if we've been any good at doing this over the years, it's probably due to the selection of the individual people on the team. And I used to keep this to myself. If I'm looking at somebody maybe to take them on, I would not give them 1 out of 10 on their characteristics or anything complex like that. I would simply use the old word of motivation, because how somebody is motivated is how they behave for themselves and therefore for their corporation or their expedition group. So for an interview, I need a very clear definition of motivation. I don't know if you remember an Irish psychologist called Anthony Clare, he's been on Radio 4 a lot. He was asked to define motivation in a single sentence. Obviously he did not do that because the Irish find it impossible to define anything in a single sentence. But what he did say was that motivation is something which happens to everybody when they're a teenager. They go at formative age, go to university, meet some professor they respect, who one day will say something illuminating to them, which will stick in their brain and form the basis of their motivation through life thereafter, which is obviously rubbish. In fact, how you are motivated is the sum total of everything that has happened to you personally since you were tiny and how you reacted to it. Possibly even before you were a child. It may be genetic. If you're born a wimp, you'll probably stay one. If you go to school and you get badly bullied when you're only 5 or 6 years old, that can have a huge effect on how you interact socially for a long time, even if you don't know it. And I think this system of selecting people only on motivation does normally work very well. Obviously there are exceptions to anything, and I've been in a very hostile environment with somebody for 2 months, thought they were great, and then seen some nasty flaw in their character which could be dangerous later on. Now when we notice this sort of thing in our team, what we do is to sack them immediately. None of this British sort of sideways promotional pussyfooting, which can end up with somebody dangerous staying around. Now, you might be, if you're cynical, and you look quite a cynical lot, thinking it's all very well for him to talk about sacking people, whereas in the real industrial world, you cannot sack people. Like in the UK, we have the Industrial Relations Act, which is designed to stop you sacking people who ought to be sacked. We, in Antarctica, have a much worse problem, which is you can sack them, but you cannot get rid of them. So, you therefore need to have a very watertight selection process up front. And I think this motivational aspect obviously applies to me. It probably goes back to when I was about 1 year old in Windsor, where I got born, outside the castle obviously, at a time when it was being bombed during the war, which my mother did not like. So she moved all of my sisters, and me aged 1, out to South Africa for 12 years without consulting us. And I have to say, this was a very nice place to get brought up, except that academically it was way behind the United Kingdom. Today it's possibly the other way around, but that's the way it was. So when we all got back here, my mother didn't have any money. She was looking for somewhere to educate us, and found, to her joy, a place called Winchester College, which took anybody totally free of charge if your family name was Fiennes. This basically was because the bloke that built the college 800 years before had been called Fiennes, and clearly liked the idea of lots of little Fienneses going there free. Also, because in those days there were actually very few of us, so it was economically safe for the college. But more recently, we started to breed like rabbits, mostly actors, and it became unsafe for the college. So after that, you could only get in free if you got the top level of entrance exam. And due to my African background, I got the bottom level, and they would not accept me, to my mother's disappointment. In fact, the only place which would take people with such a low level of intellect was, of course, Eton College. So I went there for about 5 years, but my level was so low that I couldn't even keep up with theirs. But luckily there was boxing, which did not require too much intelligence, and also stegophily. Stegophily is basically if you get born with an edifice complex, meaning you like to climb tall edifices at night in order to put things on top to annoy the school authorities. And over those 5 years at Eton, I learned, I think in the 1960s, British architects stopped using proper steel drain pipes outside buildings and switched to nasty plastic ones, which very often break when you get up to the 6th floor. So from an academic viewpoint, therefore, Eton was not a total waste of time. But going back to motivation, my mother realised that if I stayed there, I wouldn't be able to do the only thing which I wanted to do since I was a child, which was to become the commanding officer of the Royal Scots Greys Cavalry Regiment, which my dad had been commanding when he got killed in the war. Now, in his day, the regiment had 600 horses, quite romantic, and also, in order to get to be a regular British officer, you did not require A-levels. But by the time I came on the scene, the regiment had changed from horses to tanks, even though it was the British Army, and also you could not get to Sandhurst if you did not get A-levels. Therefore, my mother removed me from Eton, but she knew if I stayed there I would not get them, because the place is badly designed for getting people A-levels. And I was sent to a famous place in Brighton called Davis's, and if you went there, when you came out the other end, you definitely had your A-levels. And I'm not at all proud of breaking their record. This was not my fault. It was due to the fact that it was the height of the miniskirt era, and concentration was not therefore possible. So I failed the A-levels twice, and basically, you know, you just can't get to Sandhurst. But if that happens, like I'm sure you're aware, you've got to find a parallel route to where you want to go. And I found a place in Aldershot called Mons Cadet School. And if you went there for 5 months and could prove to the Sergeant Major that under a situation of great stress, you could still dig holes in straight lines, you could become an officer in the British Army. So I did this, and I got sent out to Germany. We were all there at that time. It was a Cold War. And I spent the next 5 years in tanks learning how to retreat from the German border. Did not practice advancing, which got pretty tedious. So when I saw a notice on the regimental board asking for officers to apply for the SAS, I put my name down, not because I knew anything about the SAS. In those days, nobody had ever heard of them. It was before Harold Wilson started to use them for PR purposes. I had obviously heard of Scandinavian Airlines services, but not this regiment. So I got sent to Hereford, which is where you go to get selected for the unit. And I found there were 190 soldiers trying to get in, 30 other officers. All of them were built like brick houses. Many of them were red berries, ex-paras. None of them came from a cavalry regiment. They called me a donkey walloper. So, to be honest, I was quite happy when this lot got ruthlessly eliminated in only 10 days, down to only 3 soldiers and 2 officers. And to my surprise, I was still there. Possibly because they were selecting people from a physical, not intellectual point of view. But sadly, on the 11th day, they switched. So I had to try to become alert. And I can remember, if you failed anything, you got thrown out immediately. And what me and the other remaining officer were having to do one particular night was to cross the local river outside Hereford by night in winter with no clothes on for some military reason. So I woke up extremely knackered the following morning at about 11 o'clock. You're meant to get up at 6 o'clock. And I panicked because they leave your instructions every day on your bed. And what it was that particular day was to steal £200,000 from the local bank in Hereford in great detail, which they checked. I had Barclays, the other officer had Lloyds. So I rushed down to the bank, but by then it was already closed, so I could not get in to do a careful burglary plan. So I went round the back and I banged on the back window, and luckily the manager came out. He was a charming bloke, very naive. And I explained that I was coming from Germany. I was trying to get into the SAS. I had brought all my family silver with me. This bit was not true. And he said, no problem, Barclays, very secure. He showed me all the electronic devices, so I thanked him, copied everything down, carbon paper in those days. One copy to the SAS headquarters just in time, and me and the other bloke went off, had a day off, went up to Birmingham, saw a film and had a spaghetti dinner, and very stupidly after dinner I left my copy of the bank raid plan in the restaurant, and the manager, later in court, gave the plans to the police. There was a ministerial inquiry in Westminster, front page of the Times, why SAS officers were stealing from banks. I was up before the colonel, who basically said, any more behaviour like this and I would be thrown out of the unit. Well, I behaved pretty well for the next year or so in the regiment, doing odd things in different parts of the world. But briefly back here, unfortunately, I got phoned by an old Italian friend, who by that time, like most of them, had become a wine salesman in the West Country. And during the course of selling his stuff in pubs down there, he discovered a village called Castle Combe, which had just been voted Europe's prettiest village by the Americans. And it was being attacked, a 20th Century Fox making a film in the village called Dr. Dolittle, which involved building this lovely trout stream into a big lake with a concrete dam 20 foot high, ruining the village. And my friend decided to bring this outrage to the general attention by blowing up the entire concrete dam the night before the film started. A good plan. But unfortunately, the police got to hear about it. They put Alsatian dogs all over the dam. But my friend had been at Eton, so he was up to that one. What he did was to rent 8 Alsatian bitches to put them upwind of the dam. But at the last minute, the bitches failed to turn up, so he phoned me to ask if I would stand in. Mainly because he knew I had just completed an Army explosives course where you learn to blow up as much as you can using as little as possible. I was pretty good at this, so I had a lot left over at the end of every day. It seemed stupid to give it back to Her Majesty, so I didn't. I put it in the boot. And 2 months later, the boot was full and sweating. And what better way of getting rid of this stuff than this public-spirited gesture? Unfortunately, everybody was caught. I was not physically caught. I'd been doing another Army course on escaping from dogs by night. But they had the car numbers. I ended up in Chippenham Prison. I was on police probation for 6 months. I was thrown out of the SAS, back to my own regiment, who were still retreating from the German border.